The Ashford mansion had once echoed with the sounds of celebration, orchestrated galas, high-stakes business meetings, the constant murmur of important people discussing important things. That world had ended the day Catherine Ashford died during childbirth, taking with her the possibility of a conventional family life. Her widower, Marcus Ashford, had transformed the grand estate into something else entirely, a sanctuary. The sprawling halls fell quiet. The ballrooms remained dark. The mansion became a temple to routine, stability, and the careful construction of a life built entirely around one person, his daughter, Sophia. Sophia was 8 years old and autistic. She communicated rarely, moved through the world via wheelchair, and experienced sensations with an intensity that most people could never quite comprehend. Marcus had learned long ago that predictability was her greatest comfort. The same rooms at the same hours, the same gentle voices, the same absence of chaos. He had built a fortune through decades of relentless work, but none of it compared to what he had learned in these quiet years with Sophia. That love was measured not in grand gestures, but in the small, consistent presence of someone who would never leave. The silence in the mansion was not sad. It was intentional, sacred. Sophia's days followed a carefully choreographed rhythm. Therapy sessions adapted to her specific needs. Tutors who came to the house, speaking softly, moving slowly. Afternoons spent near her father, whether he was working in his study or reading in the garden. She did not always respond in ways the world expected, but Marcus had learned to read the language she did speak. The slight relaxation of her shoulders when he entered a room, the way her hand would sometimes reach toward his, these small gestures meant everything. The mansion had become more than a home. It was a fortress against a world that moved too fast, spoke too loudly, demanded too much. Within its walls, Sophia could simply exist, and that was enough. Then Marcus met Vivian. She appeared at a gallery opening, elegant and luminous, and when she turned to speak to him, something shifted in his carefully ordered world. Vivian had a quality that drew people toward her like moths to flame, confidence that seemed effortless, beauty that seemed almost strategic in its deployment. She was fascinated by him, or at least she performed fascination with such convincing precision that Marcus could not distinguish between the two. "You're the one everyone whispers about," she said, touching his arm. "The billionaire who disappeared. I always love a mystery." Marcus, who had spent 8 years in deliberate solitude, found himself susceptible to being seen. Vivian saw him, or she saw the version of him she wanted to exist. She asked about his work with genuine-sounding interest. She spoke about Sophia with apparent tenderness. When he hesitated, she pressed forward gently, persistently, until his resistance crumbled. She wanted to be part of their lives, she said. She understood that Sophia was the center of everything. How could she not be? Vivian positioned herself as someone willing to enter their world rather than demand they leave it. It was a careful performance, and Marcus, lonely in ways he had not fully acknowledged, believed every word. The first time Vivian visited the mansion, she bent beside Sophia's wheelchair and spoke as if the girl were a person of infinite importance. Sophia did not react strongly, but she did not recoil. Marcus took this as permission. As he gradually allowed Vivian more access to their lives, he did not notice the subtle ways she began to reshape the mansion to suit her preferences. The removal of certain decorations, the adjustment of daily schedules, the gradual colonization of space that had once belonged only to him and Sophia. He did not notice because he did not want to. Vivian filled a loneliness he had learned to live with, and the price of that comfort seemed reasonable. Over months her presence became unavoidable. She moved through the mansion with the confidence of someone who had always belonged there. She made decisions about the household without consulting anyone. She gave instructions to the staff with an authority that was never granted to her. When Marcus finally asked her to marry him, she accepted with a smile that suggested she had always known he would. The mansion changed. The peace transformed into something tense and controlled. Margaret Cohen had worked for the Ashford family for 7 years. She was 53, observant by nature, and had developed an almost intuitive understanding of Sophia's needs. She knew which sounds caused distress, which textures brought comfort, which adjustments to routine would help or harm. She had built a quiet trust with the girl, and Sophia, in her own way, had learned to rely on her presence. The marriage brought immediate disruption. Margaret noticed the change in the mansion's atmosphere before she fully understood its source. The air felt heavier, people spoke in more guarded tones. The staff moved with less certainty, always listening for Vivian's voice, always prepared to adjust whatever they were doing if she appeared. What troubled Margaret most was how Vivian behaved when Marcus was not present. The warmth evaporated. Her voice became clipped, impatient. Margaret watched as Vivian removed Sophia's toys without explanation, placing them on high shelves beyond the girl's reach. She observed how Vivian's hands gripped the wheelchair handles with unnecessary force, how her tone shifted to something cold when she thought no one was listening. Margaret wanted to speak, but she had learned long ago that people rarely wanted to hear what service workers had to say. She kept her observations to herself, though she increased her vigilance around Sophia. She found reasons to be nearby. She created small moments of comfort when she could, a blanket when Sophia seemed cold, a gentle touch on her shoulder, a steady presence that said, "Someone still sees you." Vivian noticed Margaret's attention and resented it. She began restricting Margaret's access to Sophia, creating new rules about which rooms Margaret could enter, what hours she could work. The mansion, once a place where Margaret moved freely, became a space with invisible boundaries. She complied with every restriction while her unease grew. Marcus, observing these changes, interpreted them as Vivian establishing order. He did not recognize control when it was exercised with such careful precision. Marcus began to feel unwell in ways he could not quite articulate. A persistent exhaustion, waves of nausea that came without warning. He attributed it to stress, to the adjustments of married life, to the increasing demands of his business. He did not seek medical attention because seeking help would require acknowledging that something was wrong, and he was not ready to do that. Vivian, when he mentioned his symptoms, became solicitous. She brought him tea. She suggested he rest. She positioned herself as his caregiver, and he accepted this role with gratitude. He did not see that her concern was performed only when others were present, that when he was truly ill and alone, she watched him with something that looked less like worry and more like observation. Sophia, from her wheelchair, saw everything. She did not have words for what she witnessed, but her mind functioned like a camera with perfect recall. She saw Vivian moving through the kitchen late at night. She observed objects being hidden in places they did not belong. She noticed the careful way Vivian poured substances into cups, the swift movements followed by washing hands in a sink. Sophia recorded these images without understanding their full significance, but understanding enough to know that something was profoundly wrong. Margaret, too, had begun to notice the patterns, the specific times when Vivian was near Marcus, the frequency with which he became ill afterward, the way Vivian's expression hardened when Marcus spoke about feeling weak. But Margaret was a housekeeper, not a detective, and she had no proof of anything beyond intuition. The mansion held its collective breath, waiting for something none of them could name. Marcus collapsed in his office on a Tuesday morning, and the world fractured. The paramedics arrived within minutes. Their expressions darkened as they examined him, as they discussed signs pointing toward poisoning. The staff stood frozen in the hallways, trying to process how the man who had sustained their entire existence could suddenly become inert, possibly dead. Vivian's response was immediate and theatrical. She cried out. She called for help. She positioned herself at the center of the chaos with a performance of grief so convincing that it commanded everyone's attention. And then, as she stood in the entrance hall, surrounded by staff and emergency personnel, she pointed directly at Margaret. "She has access to everything," Vivian said, her voice trembling with apparent distress. "She handles all of his meals. She's been here for years. Who really knows what she's capable of?" The accusation landed like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread through every room, every conversation, every interaction. By the time the authorities arrived, the narrative was already forming. The loyal employee, the disgruntled housekeeper, the perfect suspect. Margaret felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The police questioned Margaret for hours. They asked the same questions repeatedly, as if repetition might catch her in a lie. They treated her answers with suspicion, her fear as evidence of guilt. The shock of Marcus's collapse, the horror of being accused, the sudden realization that everything she had built over 7 years could be dismantled in moments. All of it made her words come out fragmented, emotional, broken. She insisted on her innocence, but her insistence sounded desperate. She tried to redirect suspicion toward Vivian's strange behavior, but the detectives dismissed her claims as deflection. They had already decided what they believed. They had Vivian's composed testimony, her detailed descriptions of Margaret's supposed resentment, her subtle suggestions that Margaret had seemed unstable. Against this, Margaret's panic sounded like the last gasp of a guilty woman. The media seized the story with hungry intensity: a billionaire poisoned, a housekeeper accused. The headlines wrote themselves, and Margaret became the villain in a narrative she had never auditioned for. The courtroom doors opened, and she was pulled through them, still trying to comprehend how her life had become a catastrophe. In the chaos of the investigation, no one thought to ask Sophia what she had seen. The girl was autistic, non-verbal in the ways that mattered to the legal system. She used a wheelchair. She was a child. Surely she could not be a reliable witness to anything beyond her own confusion. This was the world's first mistake. Sophia had spent her entire life in a world that moved too fast and spoke in ways she could not easily process. But she had learned to navigate this world through intense observation. She noticed patterns others missed. She remembered details with photographic precision. She understood far more than the adults around her realized. In the weeks before Marcus's collapse, she had seen Vivian move through the mansion with a different kind of intention than she displayed when Marcus was present. She had witnessed objects being concealed in drawers, liquids being measured into cups, the careful choreography of poisoning. She had watched her father become progressively weaker, and she had understood, in the way that children understand dangerous things, that something terrible was happening. But how do you testify when words are not your language? The answer came through her new caregiver, a woman named Eleanor, who had been hired after Margaret's arrest. Eleanor was patient and observant, and one afternoon, as she helped Sophia move through the mansion, the girl began to communicate in the only way available to her. She tapped her wheelchair arm. She pointed. She guided Eleanor through the hallways with surprising insistence, stopping at specific drawers, specific shelves, specific corners where memory lived. Eleanor followed, confused at first, then increasingly uncertain, then shocked. Inside the places Sophia had indicated were bottles, containers, substances that did not belong. The evidence of a crime written in chemical compounds and careful concealment. The courtroom erupted when the evidence was presented. The judge ordered immediate examination of the bottles, their contents tested against the poison found in Marcus's system. Vivian's carefully constructed composure cracked visibly, and suddenly she was not the grieving widow, but the accused. Margaret, who had endured weeks of interrogation and media vilification, sat in stunned silence as the focus shifted away from her. The public defender squeezed her arm. Officers exchanged glances. The prosecution, so confident moments before, found themselves scrambling to reorient their case. Then came the moment that silenced every voice in the room. Eleanor was called to testify about how Sophia had led her to the evidence. She described the girl's precise gestures, her clear memory of what she had witnessed, her insistent communication that something was terribly wrong. The testimony should have been simple, a child's observations translated through gesture and action. But as Eleanor spoke, as she demonstrated the movements Sophia had made, the courtroom began to understand that they were listening to the testimony of someone who had seen everything and never forgotten. The judge called Sophia to the stand. The room held its breath as Sophia was wheeled into the center of the courtroom. She was small in the expansive space, fragile-looking, utterly vulnerable. People looked at her with a mixture of pity and skepticism. Surely this girl could not change anything. Surely her presence was merely symbolic, a gesture toward inclusion rather than actual testimony. Then the judge, with careful patience, asked Sophia to show what she had seen. Sophia lifted her hand and pointed directly at Vivian. The gesture was unmistakable in its clarity. Then, with movements refined through weeks of silent observation, she began to mime the poisoning. She demonstrated the pouring of liquid. She mimicked the measuring and mixing. She recreated with devastating precision every action she had witnessed. Her movements were simple but absolute, and in their simplicity they revealed a truth that no amount of adult testimony could obscure. The courtroom erupted. Vivian's carefully maintained facade shattered. She began to speak, to deny, to insist on her innocence, but her words fell into a void of disbelief. The jurors stared at Sophia, understanding that they had been listening to testimony from someone who saw more clearly than anyone else in the room. The prosecution moved quickly to suspend all charges against Margaret. The judge declared her innocent, and though the word should have brought relief, it felt insufficient for what she had endured. Margaret wept openly in the courtroom, her shoulders shaking with the release of terror and vindication mixed together. But there was one final twist, one last revelation that would reframe everything that had happened. As Vivian was being led away, as the courtroom descended into controlled chaos, the doors opened. A man entered, supported by 2 security officers, and every voice in the room stopped mid-word. Marcus Ashford walked into his own courtroom, alive. The shock was absolute and immediate. People rose from their seats, cameras flashed, reporters gasped. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, no one could process what they were seeing. Marcus raised a hand, and slowly the room quieted. He approached the bench and, in a voice still weak but steady, began to explain. He had suspected Vivian weeks before the collapse. He had noticed the patterns, the way his symptoms intensified after certain meals, the careful distance she maintained when he was truly vulnerable. He had feared not just for himself, but for Sophia. And so, with the help of a small group of trusted security professionals, he had faked his death. He had allowed himself to be monitored in secret, to appear unconscious while remaining conscious, to watch as Vivian revealed herself completely in her response to his apparent demise. It had been a risk, a desperate gamble, but it had worked. The evidence was incontestable. Vivian's crimes were undeniable, and the woman who had nearly been condemned had been saved by a child who had seen everything and found a way to speak. In the weeks that followed, the mansion slowly returned to itself. Margaret was reinstated with an increased salary and a position that reflected her true value to the family. Jonathan thanked her personally for her loyalty, and though the words could not undo the terror she had experienced, they carried weight. She moved through the familiar rooms with cautious relief, allowing herself to believe that the nightmare had truly ended. Sophia underwent extensive evaluations by specialists who marveled at her observational abilities and her capacity to communicate complex information without words. They praised her intelligence, her precision, her courage. Marcus, listening to these assessments, felt a deep pride in his daughter and a profound gratitude that her silence had been broken at exactly the right moment. The mansion was carefully cleaned of every reminder of Vivian's presence. Rooms were rearranged, security systems were upgraded. The space that had become a prison gradually transformed back into a sanctuary, and within it, Marcus and Sophia and Margaret began the careful work of healing. Marcus became more present in Sophia's life than he had ever been. He spent hours with her each day, engaged in quiet activities that strengthened their bond. He planned for their future with renewed purpose, expanded therapies, deeper education, a life built on the foundation of stability and genuine love. He had learned, through nearly losing everything, what actually mattered. Peace returned to the Ashford mansion, settling into the hallways and rooms like morning light. The staff moved with ease again. Margaret worked with quiet confidence. Sophia showed clearer signs of comfort and trust, and Marcus moved through his home with the calmness of a man who had been given a second chance and intended to spend it wisely. The trauma had left marks, but it had also revealed something essential about the people who truly mattered: loyalty, courage, the unspoken love of those who choose to show up day after day for the people they care about. A difficult chapter had ended. A new one was beginning, and in the quiet rooms of the mansion, in the small moments of connection between a father and daughter, between a man and the woman who had protected his child, the future looked, for the first time in months, genuinely peaceful. The truth, spoken in silence and gesture, and the clarity of a child's unwavering memory had prevailed. And in prevailing, it had saved them all.